There are a lot of victims who feel like I'm the only one and it was my fault. And until they realize, wait, no, what happened to you was part of a larger pattern, a lot of them continue to carry that.
From Christianity Today, you're listening to The Bulletin, a podcast about the people, events, and issues that are shaping our world. I'm Clarissa Mall, producer and moderator of The Bulletin. In this episode, Russell Moore, Mike Cosper, and I talk with Nicole Martin about Robert Morris and why churches harbor predators. Next, nationalism is increasing in Europe. Are the threats the same as we've seen on our own shores, or are they different? Finally, let's have some fun. Find out what The Bulletin is reading this summer. We share our favorite reads for those easy breezy days of summer. Welcome to the show. On Tuesday evening, megachurch pastor Robert Morris resigned after information became public that the relationship he had previously described to his church as an extramarital affair was actually sexual abuse against a child. Morris's congregation, Gateway Church, has launched an investigation into the 35-year-old allegations of this abuse, allegations that the victim, Cindy Clemishire, asserts she brought to the knowledge of the church leadership more than 20 years ago. Last week, Boz Chivijan joined us to talk about clergy's sexual misconduct related to adults. And if you haven't listened to that episode, I commend that conversation to you. It was an important one. Today, though, we want to talk about a specific dimension of this topic that continues to poison and haunt the church: the twin difficulties of cover-up and pastoral restoration. If you've shaken your head at the headlines thinking, how do these things keep happening? You are not alone. Mike, I wonder if you can give us a little background as we begin, talking about who Robert Morris is and what we've learned about him in the last week.
Robert Morris, is a pastor of a church called Gateway. This is a very large, very influential church. It's sort of on the charismatic end of the spectrum inside evangelical life in North America. Church itself had an attendance of more than 20,000 people, but had a reach through multi-site and broadcast and various things to, I've read, north of 100,000 people either watching the sermons on Sundays or through broadcasts and various other means. So Morris was a significantly influential figure in the charismatic church world, also just sort of in the Dallas church world generally. If you're involved in the church in Dallas, you know about Gateway. You've probably been to events at Gateway. So when this report came out, it definitely made waves right away. It initiated with a report on the Wartburg Watch, which is kind of a watchdog blog that looks at church abuse oftentimes as well. One of the significant aspects of this story is that at no point did Morris deny it. When they issued a statement in the aftermath of the report, he acknowledged it with language that minimized it, referring it to as inappropriate sexual behavior with a young lady. He was in his 20s. She was 12 when this took place. So that language is wildly inappropriate, to say the very least. After a week or so, it's led to this resignation. I think we're probably just beginning to see the aftershocks of this. Because again, this is a very influential figure. This is somebody a lot of people have a lot of affections for. This is also a church that's had its own controversies around Morris for some time as well, simply because there have been allegations of an unhealthy culture in the church. And so I think you'll begin to see more stories related to that as well in the days ahead.
The reason why I want to talk about communication specifically today is because much of cover-up is just that, right? Who gets the information, how that information is used, how much of that information is conveyed to others and to whom. And a number of denominations are dealing with this fallout of cover-up right now. The Anglican Church is, the PCA, the Southern Baptists. Russell, could you give us a sense of, regardless of denominational structure or polity, do most churches have a solid process to deal with these claims of sexual abuse? And do they have a pathway for communication that is workable?
Well, there's no excuse now not to. I mean, for many years, I would work to educate churches. Look, this can happen to you. You're not invulnerable to it. Get policies together. You're going to have to change policies over time, but at least have them and have ways of knowing this is how we're going to deal with someone who has been victimized. This is how we're going to hold accountable somebody who has done this. This is how we're going to notify law enforcement and the way that we're going to notify the rest of the congregation so that we don't end up with other people being victimized or being destroyed. There's no excuse now, after all that we've seen, not to have. There are many resources available for congregations. And at this point, it's willful ignorance not to do that. And the other thing, when you mentioned communication, the language that is being used in the confession, so called, from Robert Morris is not just uh, minimization, it is an outright lie. What we're talking about here is rape. What Robert Morris confessed to is rape. You don't have a sexual relationship, an inappropriate relationship with a 12-year-old child. A grown adult rapes a 12-year-old child when there's sexual contact. And so part of the enraging nature of this is the language that was used. And then for Robert Morris to say, well, it was only kissing and petting and not intercourse. Whoever in that congregation allowed that statement to go out, the entire leadership should be gone immediately and probably should be investigated by law enforcement. What did you know and when did you know it? And how on earth would you allow this to be the way that you would further victimize this woman who was raped as a child?
Nicole, as a woman in ministry, how does all of this fall on your ears and on your heart?
It's a very painful thing. I mean, I think a lot about the systems that allow for things like this to happen. And as you know, my dad was a pastor. We were Baptist for a while, and then he came into Methodism. But I remembered in the context of the Baptist church, the autonomy, the governance is the board of directors or the deacon board or the board of elders. And they are the ones who are supposed to have oversight over the pastor. However, as a child growing up, what I experienced and what I saw was while the deacon board and the elders had governance over the pastor also got to influence who became a deacon or an elder. So it was easy for people that the pastor likes to be the people that would be the elders. It's easy to pull in people, as we learned even from the Mark Driscoll situation, to pull in people who are indebted in some way to the pastor. And then there's kind of a yes board. There's a loyalty built into the framework of the accountability of the church. So when that happens, there are so many dynamics. There's a power dynamic. There's the phrase, you don't bite the hand that feeds you going on when you have elders or deacons who are in some way indebted to the pastor and the pastor is in some way indebted to them. So it makes me realize again that in the context of at least the autonomy of the local church in Baptist denominations, this happens all the time. So what hits me is not just the Robert Morris issue. It's not just this one thing. What hits me is all of the 12-year-old girls and women and boys and men who have been taught to believe, A, this is a person of authority, B, I can't and shouldn't speak up, and C, even if I did speak up, they won't do anything because they were handpicked and selected for their loyalty.
Or if they do, they'll blame you.
And then you lose your credibility, you lose your community, you lose all of these things on top of having to process within yourself what it takes to actually come forward. It's a whole emotional crisis.
When these sort of things surface in a congregation, how much do you feel like the congregants should know?
The congregation should know everything that would not further victimize the survivor or hamper an ongoing investigation. So, beyond that, a congregation should know everything for all kinds of reasons. I mean, one of them being the congregation has an accountability before God and before society to take care of this, but also because we talked about this psychological victimization that takes place. There are a lot of victims who feel like I'm the only one and it was my fault. And until they realize, wait, no, what happened to you was part of a larger pattern, a lot of them continue to carry that. And also because so many of these things, they're not just limited to one congregation, they're interconnected. Nicole mentioned Mark Driscoll. Remember that Robert Morris is the one who restored Mark Driscoll to ministry just weeks after the collapse of Mars Hill. One of the things that I think we should pay attention to that came out of the Boston Globe investigations into the Roman Catholic Church is how much of a role mutual blackmail not formalized blackmail, but just, I'll turn a blind eye to you if you'll turn a blind eye to me. How much that plays in, and it's not just in a really highly structured sort of organization like Roman Catholicism, it can happen in these networks as well.
This is internal communication. This is how a victim comes forward, how they're treated, how that's communicated to the leadership, to the congregation. But let's now shift to talking about external communication, because I think that's a really important dimension of our understanding of clergy abuse and cover up. In the recent weeks, Dallas pastor Tony Evans issued a very vague statement and simply stepped down from ministry after acknowledging a quote unquote past sin, which is a similar kind of linguistic move to what we saw at Gateway Church. And Cindy Clemishire, Robert Morris's victim, was asked to sign a non disclosure agreement and accept a financial settlement, which she refused. She didn't want to be restricted to being silent. I wonder, what is the role of external communication when we see ministers fall into specific sin? Who do you think is responsible? What should be said? Should anything be material for an NDA?
In this case, I think what does have to be communicated is it has to be more than this was not criminal, because there are all kinds of things that are not criminal. I think all of this is disqualifying to any individual for ministry, but there are areas that are also disqualifying for the leadership of the church. So a congregation does need to know, was this so-called affair, if it is an affair, was that happening with somebody in the congregation? In which case there's an abuse of spiritual authority that's taking place or not. I agree with you that no one should reveal the name of the other party, and certainly not a victim of abuse, apart from that person cooperating with it. But there needs to be more said than simply something happened, it wasn't good, and it wasn't illegal. There needs to be more of a disclosure, I think, than that.
For me, looking at the Evans situation in particular, what I see in that is I see the temptation that's going to be there for any leader in that position, which is, let's disclose the minimum possible, because the less we disclose, the easier it becomes for me to make my reentry into the public square. If on the backside of this, we don't know. I mean, I think that's one of the things that's really important to say. Because we don't know, we don't want to speculate. But if we're in a place where 18 months from now, we see the reinvention and restoration and return of Tony Evans without any disclosure, without any sense of what happened, what was the restoration process, what was done in terms of repentance and accountability. That's the thing that I think my concern is, that we're going to see a story like that over the next several months, which I think is just really bad for the church. And one of the reasons why I think it's bad for the church is because for the average Christian and for the member in the congregation, the impulse is to restore. We think the impulse of Christians is to drag people to the edge of town and stone them as soon as it's possible. But I don't think that's the case. The stronger impulse, especially with a pastor, with somebody who you've got this affection for, the impulse is to say, man, I want to forgive this person because of all that God has done through them for me. And forgiveness is certainly the right impulse, but restoration isn't necessarily. And so I fear, when I see that pattern of a lack of disclosure, a lack of clarity, non-specific confession of sin, that seems to set the table for that sort of thing down the line.
We think that personal shame, being ashamed by the abuser or by the immoral person, is enough to keep that person out of this sort of reentry, when that is almost never the case. It's usually the very same sort of shamelessness and seared conscience that led to these multiple situations that will cause that person to be more than happy to reenter.
Let's talk about that communication of reentry, because just a week and a half ago, former Hillsong pastor Carl Lentz and his wife appeared on Nightline to talk about his affair and their road to reconciliation. And he started a new podcast, which he claims isn't a return to ministry. But author Caitlin Beatty wrote in her Substack this week, swirling in the background of pastor comeback stories is the horror that these important men would deign to take a regular job. And I wonder, is there a point where a leader permanently loses their privilege of platform?
Paul says, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, that a minister, an elder, must be beyond reproach. Does that mean that someone cannot come back from some sort of sin? No, I think that there are obviously all kinds of sins and failures that people can come back from. The abuse of one's spiritual authority to prey upon the flock is not one of them. That is no one who can be ever in that situation again, for the same reasons that anybody that would say, well, this person who was convicted of child molestation, it's been a while. Maybe it's time to have him teach vacation Bible school again. No, he never comes anywhere near vacation Bible school again. And the same thing happens for this misuse of spiritual authority, even if it's not, as in some of these cases, rape.
But why are they allowed to come back? Because the issue for me isn't that a Carl Lentz is coming back, so to speak, or that Mark Driscoll has another church. It's not them for me that they would get themselves out of
Yeah.
there. They're narcissists. They
Mhm.
think they belong. They are shameless, as you stated, Russell. The issue is there's always going to be an audience. There will always be a group of people who say, I will take the fruit and throw away the root. I am totally fine listening to this person because it validates some part of me. So,
Mhm.
when the Carl Lentz thing came out, it dawned on me again, we are in a culture where both you can get a ton of fans because they're following and they're tracking because they want to know the negative, and you can have a ton of fans who are completely ignorant and they don't care about your character as long as they can consume what you have to give. So it's like this symptom of this dark consumeristic society. We watch either because we can't turn away, or we watch and we consume because, oh, that feeds me, throw away the other things. The saddest part for me is the young people who are considering, is ministry for me? The ones who have sex addictions, the ones who are stuck on some grievous issue, and they still have people in their lives saying, you can do it. Don't worry about those things. If such and such can do it, you can do it too.
That's exactly it. I think it's not just that people wave this away. I think there's the same dynamic at work here with, for instance, Kenneth Copeland. And there's a report that says he has this much money, these many private jets, and this is his house. And they think that's going to dissuade people when it actually is what his audience is looking for. I want to vicariously be you. Your private jet is my private jet. And I think there are all kind of people who are willing to say, yeah, you can get back up without accountability and keep right on moving for the exact same reasons that Paul, for instance, in Romans, is carefully laying out the case. We are not saying that because grace abounds where there is sin, let us sin all the more. That's very appealing to a lot of people.
Chuck DeGroat talks about this in his work on narcissism, that it's critical to remember that narcissism is a symbiotic relationship. And that when we talk about a culture of narcissism, we're not just talking about everybody's a narcissist now. We're talking about a culture of narcissism as a culture that fosters narcissistic entanglement between individuals and narcissistic leaders. I mean, this is where we need the gospel, right? Like, there's something in us that is looking for someone messianic who has a message, a story, a way of presenting themselves that we're able to look at them and go, that gives me hope, that gives me optimism, that gives me a sense of connection to God and mercy and grace. I mean, you can really see it in the story of like a fallen and restored leader, that when you have a kind of narcissistic entanglement with a person like that, you can internalize that as an experience of grace, like a vicarious experience of grace through those kinds of leaders. And there's a way in which I can even in my head sort of tell that story that's very powerful and very moving.
All of this conversation is happening just a week after abuser Paul Pressler passed away, and after the abuse reforms that folks had hoped for in the SBC are kind of drying up on the vine. I think the darkness deepens. Lord, with me abide. Church, we've certainly got our work cut out for us. So go shine the light in dark places, bind up the wounds of the hurting, and please advocate for justice in your spheres of influence. As they say, if you see something, please say something. We will be right back. You've heard of MAGA, but have you heard of MEGA? Borrowing from former President Trump's marketing playbook, Hungary is the latest European country to make overtly nationalistic claims. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban unveiled this new slogan, Make Europe Great Again, on hats at a recent press conference in advance of assuming the EU presidency. For Europeans, MEGA has similar ambitions to its stateside MAGA cousin: tighter immigration, the promotion of far-right political leadership, and country-first international policy that is playing itself out right now from the White Cliffs of Dover to Russia's continuing war with Ukraine. For example, last week, President Macron of France called for snap elections in response to rising nationalism in his country. And Mike, I wonder if you could just start this with telling us what's happening here in France. What happened to motivate this decision?
So last week were the European Union parliamentary elections. So all the various states of the EU elect representatives to that body. And in a somewhat of a surprise, the right-wing nationalist party in France, which is a party called National Rally, won the majority of the seats in the European Parliament by a significant number. And so within hours of those elections, Emmanuel Macron called for snap parliamentary elections in France. Now, some things that I think are helpful for U.S. listeners to know: the French system is very different than ours. This is not a two-party system. It's more like a 6 to 12-party system, depending on how you break it down. What's happening right now is that the various parties that are competing against one another in France have kind of coalesced into 3 coalitions that are competing with one another right now. The largest one right now, the one that looks by some count favored to win, is this National Rally Party, which is the right-wing nationalist group. There's a group called New Popular Front, which is basically the collection of all of the far left parties inside of France: the socialist left, the Marxist left. And then there's a party that's called Renaissance. That's Emmanuel Macron's party. That's sort of the centrist group that he's trying to hold together. And one of two things is going to happen in this election. It seems as though either Macron thinks he can actually win. He thinks that if he gets the turnout that he wants by calling the snap elections, he's going to have sort of frightened the population enough that people are going to actually turn out and vote in a way that sort of pushes back against this right-wing insurgents. Or he might be thinking he's going to lose this election, and this National Rally, this right-wing party, is going to come into the parliament. And as soon as you get elected and in power, you become a lot less popular very quickly. And so some of this right-wing fervor that's in the air right now might be burning off. The first round of elections will happen on June 30th. There's 577 seats in the French parliament. So there'll be lots of candidates running for those seats. And then if any candidate wins 50%, they get the seat. If no candidate wins 50%, the top 2 will continue to a runoff election on July 7th. The top 2 plus anybody who got over 12.5%. Welcome to France, everybody.
And they think the Electoral College is complicated.
I know, exactly. It's very complicated, and it makes it really unpredictable. The National Rally Party is a right-wing French nationalist party that is not just hostile in terms of being anti-Semitic historically, but is hostile to immigration in general. And a lot of what's animating some of the right-wing fury in Western Europe right now is related to immigration policy, asylum policy, and a massive population of immigrants and asylum seekers that have been coming into Western Europe since the Arab Spring about 15 years ago.
And at the same time, we have the United Kingdom elections taking place, which are looking to be a massive labor blowout election. I was talking yesterday to someone who's part of one of the smaller, more centrist parties there, who was saying that what he's worried about is what appears to be the total collapse of the Conservative Party. And I said, why are you concerned about that when that's not your party? And he said, because it is such a collapse. I mean, some projections have them going down to like 53 seats. And he said, what's going to replace them on the right, if you still think in those categories, is this sort of ethno-nationalist illiberalism. That's part of the problem, is even using these categories of right and left here, we tend to think of American conservatism and American progressivism, which are both trying to conserve or progress on the basis of liberal democracy, constitutional order. That's not what's going on here. These are Hungary and these sorts of places that are becoming influential and models in the United States and in other places are hostile to the idea of a free people. And you add to that the sort of Christian element of people seeing Hungary and Russia and these places as models of Christian civilization when there's zero vitality of actual Christianity in any of those places. It's really telling as to what kind of Christianity some people want.
Is there social contagion going on here? Has Europe caught our disease? You talk about modeling, or is this something that has been rising across the pond independently of what's been happening as far as nationalism and far right in the US?
To some degree, it's a post Cold War bubbling up that we're seeing the effects of much more right now. That's one of the ironies of it, is that you have a rage against globalism and globalization that's happening through global networks that are attempting to replicate the same sort of model of grievance, retribution, anti-immigrant sentiment. But you add to that the use of the tools of the state to help one's friends and exercise retribution against one's enemies.
Mike, a piece in Politico this week noted that frustrated young voters are those who are fueling nationalistic fires in Europe. This writer said that their grandparents ushered in the sexual revolution, and today's youth want to turn back the clock to 1950. So you talked about the refugee crisis, but there's also a shrinking birth rate in many of these nations. There have got to be real concerns that are somewhat underpinning, perhaps, that stand behind this performative nationalism? Are there things we have to acknowledge that are real aches and pains in Europe right now?
I think so. I mean, I think the asylum and immigration crisis is a real thing. And the way that it has reshaped the culture of Western Europe is pretty significant. 38% of German school children are the children of immigrants. In England and Wales, the number 2 most popular name for newborn boys is Muhammad. And then I think one of the things that you've seen as well is that since October the 7th, when you've seen these outbursts of anti-Semitism on the streets of big European cities, you're not necessarily seeing ethnic Germans, ethnic French, ethnic Britons marching in the streets, calling for a free Palestine from the river to the sea. You're largely seeing these immigrant communities coming to the streets to advocate for these things. And so I think there are significant questions to examine about how do we think about immigration and asylum, and how do we think about it in terms of what does healthy civic assimilation look like? One of the things that has taken place over the past decade is that there's been this migrant crisis. It has reshaped culture, has reshaped the feel of culture, particularly in these like dense urban cities where these populations are concentrated. And it becomes difficult for politicians and leaders to talk about it and to confront it without quickly being accused of, well, you're just being Islamophobic, you're being hostile to immigrants, these are asylum seekers, they're fleeing wars, all of which there's some validity to all of that as well. So when you have this kind of civic unrest, and when you have some of the violence in the streets, and when you have a tremendous amount of violence against Jews that's insurgent in Western Europe right now, when there's not a language from the center or the left to talk about how do we confront some of these issues, the right-wing populists that show up talking about it in ways that are often outrageous and inhumane have traction in ways that they might not have otherwise.
But that's been the problem all along. This is how fascism emerged in the 20s and 30s. This sense of national humiliation coming out of World War I in Germany and in Austria. You had an exhausted center and a completely hapless left. And people who were saying, well, I mean, what are you going to do? These people are clowns. Let's humor them. And then you end up with what we had. And you see that with the distinct difference being you had some movements in the US and in England that were sympathetic to some of that, but you didn't have the level of sympathy that we see happening right now in the free world when it comes to illiberal actions. And so that's really, really concerning. But there's always going to be I'm going to look at some problem and to say, I alone can fix it. And the way that we fix it is with this blood and soil reaction. And the results are never good.
This sounds like a moment for the church. And I wonder, here in the US, the evangelical church has been sucked into, or perhaps has produced in some places, a nationalism. What is the relationship between the evangelical church and the nationalist movement in Europe?
Tobias Kramer has done studies on this showing that in Europe, there's actually a vaccination effect for people who are church going Christians of various kinds in a way that's not true in the United States. Now, the problem is you don't have very many of those people. I mean, the question of what are the evangelicals in Hungary doing does not really matter. I mean, it matters in heaven, but it doesn't matter in terms of what goes on in Hungary because there's so few of them. And the same would be, I mean, France, England. I mean, there are evangelical Christians there in church planting movements, but they are very, very small and increasingly odd. So if you look at, for instance, the anti Muslim sort of sentiment, anti migrant sentiment that you see in France, is directed not just toward Muslims, but also toward evangelical Christians or anyone who takes a sense of religion more seriously than just national identity. So there's some deep currents here, and I don't think that there's enough of a vigorous religious response in most of Western Europe right now to counteract it.
The Wall Street Journal reported this week that evangelical churches are being targeted by Russia. Why would Russia care about erasing evangelical churches in Ukraine?
Well, a lot of it has to do with the collaboration of a Christian nationalist Russian Orthodox Church with the late Soviet Empire and now with the Russian authoritarian regime. And that's been long going. I mean, when my wife and I were in Russia adopting our oldest two children 20 something years ago, it was very important that I not say to anyone that I'm a Baptist. And that wasn't because of state pressure. It was because the Russian Orthodox Church in this region tells people that Baptists buy children to bake them and eat them. And the evangelicals who were there were beleaguered culturally long before they were beleaguered actually by the state. And so there's something about if you actually have a real emphasis upon personal relationship with Jesus that is threatening to an authoritarian state unless the state controls that perceived personal relationship with Jesus. And so getting rid of any competitor to Russian Orthodoxy, whether that's Jehovah's Witnesses or evangelicals or anybody else, has been a big priority for a long time. And when it comes to Russia with Ukraine, that has to do with cultural domination and humiliation. Same reason that you have Ukrainian children being kidnapped and then being adopted out in a place that has no adoption culture, even of their own orphans. But it's a way to humiliate Ukrainians by saying, we're going to raise your children and we're going to raise them as Russians. And the same thing is true to say, we're going to take your churches and your churches ultimately are going to be outposts of Russia.
I did think it was fascinating that one of the other surprises in the parliamentary elections, while Germany and France had this kind of surprise showing from their right flank, was that the right-wing parties in some of the states that are closest to Russia and Ukraine underperformed in those elections. So Poland, Finland, Slovakia, I believe, those nations where they're bordering on the Russia-Ukraine conflict and where the worst implications of right-wing nationalism are on display are not responding the same way in this moment. And I think that's very telling as well.
Are there particular lessons for us as Americans for how the church can engage or should be present in the midst of this?
There's a lesson for the church and there's a lesson for us as Americans. And I think the lesson for us as Americans is to say, this is the entire project that Washington and Jefferson and Madison and Hamilton worked to free us from and to see to it that constitutional provisions were put in place to keep this very thing from happening. And so if we yield to it, we're yielding a near 250-year project that has been the envy of the world. And as the church, I think it has to do with looking at not just in these situations, but throughout history, what does it mean when the church's witness is co opted by something else? And usually, What the something else is the valorization of the flesh that has to do with blood and soil and nationalism. And once the church does that, there is no witness. And so look at the German Christian movement and the exact same process of all we want you to do is to signal your nationalistic loyalty. And then it is all that we want you to do is to emphasize these things and not those things. Keeps going until it's Heil Hitler and you can't use the Old Testament anymore. And you have to keep your mouth shut when it comes to actual genocide and authoritarianism. That process doesn't happen all at once. It happens by stages, and if we don't pay attention to that, we end up losing the church itself.
These French elections, I think, are going to tell us a lot about where people really do stand. Nationalism thrives on romanticism, and it thrives on a mythological past that we're going to return to. And so I think for a lot of young French people who are seeing like a lot of lack of opportunity, and they're seeing crime and they're seeing urban decay and all the rest, they're like, if we elect the nationalists, we'll all be driving MGs and making cheese and growing grapes in 6 years, and the world's going to be a lot better place. But the extent to which that, as Russell said, the extent to which that's utopian and very unrealistic, I think is just lost on people, because that's part of what social media TikTok culture allows you to do, is it allows you to indulge these powerful imaginative fantasies. And the extent to which that's going to shape the future of Europe is very, very scary to me.
Gentlemen, this is so instructive and helpful in seeing through those myths that you talked about, Mike. Thanks so much for this conversation. Don't go away, listeners. We will be right back. Reading programs are a ubiquitous part of summer life for most American children. Whether you signed up at your local library as a kid or were assigned that tedious list from your classroom school teacher, you probably had a few books under your arm each summer growing up. But kids aren't the only ones who participate in summer reading. Of course, adults love a good beach read too. Reading aloud, in particular, research tells us, kicks those benefits up a notch, measurably enhancing our interpersonal relationships as well. Are you drawn to a particular genre in the summertime?
So for me, I'm drawn to fiction that will either give me another glimpse of a reality that's not my own, or murder mysteries. Those are the only two categories. So on my murder mystery category, I was reading The Lagos Wife by Vanessa Walters about this woman. Her family's from Jamaica, but she lives in the UK and she marries this guy who's Nigerian. And then she goes off to Nigeria and she's murdered. Well, she's presumed murdered. I shall not give it away. But yeah, you get on the plane, you need something that's just going to take you away. And then my at night get into something deep book is The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store by James McBride. It is really good.
Mike and Russell, you travel a lot. Do you read paper books or do you read digitally?
I just got back from the beach. I do both. I read more on Kindle these days than not because I have terrible vision and Kindle reading is just a lot easier and a lot faster, but I still love a real book. So when I find one that feels good and the print's big enough and I'm going to the beach, there's nothing better than that. I'll sit at the beach for 12 hours reading on a vacation. And one of the books that I took this year was Stephen King's new short story collection.
You want it darker?
Yeah.
That one? Yeah.
Oh, man. So I've been reading Stephen King since I was a kid. My dad was a big fan. I always like his stuff. Like most of it is just sort of pulpy, page turner stuff. But his short stories are his best writing,
yes,
I think.
I agree.
And they are just always power packed in terms of the characters, the plot and everything. And I would say of his stuff that I've read in recent years, the first short story in the new book, which is about 60 pages, it's about this writer who's in his 90s. It's about the son of the writer who's in his 90s, who at midlife made this career pivot from running like a junkyard to writing literary fiction and becoming a beloved, world-renowned figure. It's worth the $22 for the book for this one short story. It was so good I read it twice. I loved it, and I immediately turned back to the beginning of the book to read it again. Another one of the books that I read when I was down there was Frank Bruni's book, The Age of Grievance. Not light beach reading, probably for a lot of people, but it's the kind of stuff that I loved. And it's a really worthwhile book. And just a teaser, we have Bruni on the Bulletin coming up here in a couple of weeks to talk about that book. And we had a great conversation the other day digging into that. So listeners can get the book now and then look forward to the interview in a couple of weeks.
What about you, Russell? What are you reading?
I just finished a book called When the Clock Broke, which is about how the decade of the 1990s explains the world that we're in right now. And it was a really perceptive and at times fun book with a lot of dark themes in it too. I have Stephen King's You Want It Darker. I'm about to start that. I'm in the middle of, and I hate to even say this because sometimes, and I recommend books, people think, oh, you're saying this is good, edifying book that you agree with the premise of it. And I don't agree with the premise of it, but it's called The Egypt Cycle, but with an A. And it's 4 books by John Crowley that essentially is a Gnostic parable. And so there are a lot of Gnostic themes that I disagree with, but he is an amazing storyteller. And I just finished this Malcolm Guite book on the life of Coleridge called Mariner. And it's kind of set around Rime of the Ancient Mariner, but it's more than that. And I think somebody could read that book, not care anything about the Romantic poets or about Coleridge or about anything else, and still come away with a lot. Because that's Malcolm Guite. I mean, he's
so good.
He's so good. Yeah.
Well, listeners, we know you've got your own reading to get to, so we'll sign off for this week. But before we go, here are some other books I think you'll enjoy. But as LeVar Burton used to say on Reading Rainbow, you don't have to take my word for it.
Eric Petrick here. I'm currently reading Alice Munro's Lives of Girls and Women. I just finished rereading Cormac McCarthy's All the Pretty Horses. In terms of theology, I'm working through a great recommendation from Russell Moore by Leon Cass called The Beginning of Wisdom, which is essentially a commentary on the book of Genesis. It's amazing.
Hey, Bulletin listeners, David Zoll here. For my summer reading picks, I'd first go with Fully Alive by Elizabeth Oldfield. Oldfield is a podcaster and a writer over in England, and what she's done with this book is really just penned a deeply engaging and fresh introduction to the Christian faith in a way, in such like a form that you can kind of give to anyone.
I'm Leslie Thompson. I'm the associate producer for The Bulletin, and on my morning side table, I've got Madeleine L'Engle's The Irrational Season. This particular book is about marriage and child rearing, which is right in the center of where I find myself these days. I'm also reading through Kenneth Feinberg's What is Life Worth? Kenneth Feinberg was the mediator for the 9/11 Survivors Fund, and it's a really interesting look at how law and relationship can meet to provide comfort.
You'll find links to each of these books in the show notes, so grab them at your favorite bookstore or through interlibrary loan. Thanks for joining us this week on The Bulletin. We will see you next week. The Bulletin is a production of Christianity Today. It's produced by Clarissa Mall. The associate producer is Leslie Thompson. This episode was mixed by TJ Hester. Theme music by Dan Phelps. Eric Petrick and Mike Cosper are the executive producers of CT Media Podcasts, and Matt Stevens is our senior producer. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review to help more people find the show. Thanks for listening.